So welcome to the Maverick Catholic, where we explore bold, inclusive, mystical spirituality beyond institutional walls. And today I'm joined by Bishop David Oliver Kling, a Catholic bishop, chaplain, UCC pastor, and a spiritual trailblazer.
I don't know about that, but I'll take it.
Yes, I just want to say that you are one of my spiritual heroes. And I really mean that, and I'm so thrilled to have you on with us.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
So I'll just jump into it. If you don't mind telling us a bit about your spiritual journey up to this point.
Well, I will give the Cliff Notes version. I won't go into all the detail, but I will touch the bases of those milestones that will probably be of interest to the people watching this channel. So my first sojourn into what I would consider the Independent Sacramental Movement, although they certainly wouldn't use that term, was in the early 1990s when I was baptized by a priest who was loosely affiliated with the Society of St. Pius X, which is a very ultra right-wing conservative protesting of the Second Vatican Council, that sort of thing. So I was baptized at Our Lady of Fatima Chapel by the late Father Joseph Terry Marks. And then about a year or so later, I was confirmed by Bishop Richard Williamson of the Society of St. Pius X. He has been since removed from the society and formally excommunicated. But he's a kind of a he's if you look him up, he's a kind of a whack job. But he was the bishop that confirmed me, and that would have been in, I think, 1992 or 93. And then shortly thereafter, I entered Christ the King Monastery, which was a traditionalist Catholic Benedictine community in Coleman, Alabama. And while I was there, I was known as Frater Wolfgang, and that was my monastic name. I was Wolfgang. And so I did that for a little while. When I left the monastery, and I mainly left because I couldn't take the us versus them polemic constantly. You know, we were the true Catholics. Everybody else was getting it wrong. And I just got tired of that. I kept pointing out that the Catholic or the Byzantine Catholics and the Orthodox have, valid liturgies. What about them? Oh, well, they're schismatics. And I'm like, well, so are we. And like, oh no, we're not schismatic. We're the true Catholics. Okay, that got too much. So I left there and lived with a Romanian Byzantine Rite priest for a while. And then after that, there was periods of time when I wasn't practicing anything, and I bounced from a lot of different spiritual practices and whatnot until back in 2004, I found my way back into the Independent Sacramental Movement kind of by accident. And it was at that point that I received the whole gambit of holy orders, and I have been a bishop ever since. And originally it was through, more of a sort of a mystical brand of Christianity. And through that, since that point in 2004, I've worked in Unitarian churches. I've preached in Methodist churches. I preached in UCC churches. And basically until 2014, I asked for incarnation into the Young Rite, which was a jurisdiction at the time headed by Bishop Marcus van Alphen, who has since retired. There were two other bishops involved with the Young Rite, and they're in Slovenia. And in 2016, I think it was 2016, I was brought on as Marcus's replacement in the ruling group of the Young Rite. And I never technically resigned from that, although we've been the Young Rite's pretty much been active on an international level since probably 2017 was the last time we met. So in 2018, I started the Community of St. George and the Sacramental Whine podcast. And the Community of St. George was originally set up as a Young Rite jurisdiction, and then that evolved, and then we became the Ancient Apostolic Church of Alexandria, and which continues to evolve, and we're now kind of identifying as the Alexandrian community, still the Ancient Apostolic Church of Alexandria, but that's a pretty long phrase to roll off the tongue. So we've been kind of going by Alexandrian community, and most of us who are involved in the community are doing some form of ministry, either as chaplaincy or myself, I'm serving a UCC congregation as their pastor. We have other folks who are serving congregations in mainline denominations, because many of the mainline denominations are struggling to find clergy. And like I said, many of us work as chaplains. I worked as a hospice chaplain for 12 years. So that is the cliff notes of my spiritual journey that would probably be of interest to folks here.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that in such a clear and succinct way. For our listeners who don't know, can you tell us a bit more about what is the Young Rite that now developed into the Alexandrian Church?
Oh, well, the Young Rite was an interesting experiment. Marcus van Alphen he grew up in the liberal Catholic Church, the main liberal Catholic Church. There's some splinters, but the main one he grew up in, and his father had been presiding bishop, so he had good LCC roots, basically. He was born in that tradition. His father was a priest and then presiding bishop. And one of the things that he felt the liberal Catholic Church was not nearly liberal enough. And I say that because they wouldn't ordain women, and they still don't. Now, there are other branches of the LCC, like the LCC International, that does, but the main liberal Catholic Church does not. And he felt that was a problem. He also felt like, and I could be wrong with this, but this is what I have picked up, having been involved, is that the liberal Catholic Church in some ways was similar to like where the Episcopal Church is in the US, in that it may take somebody years and years to become a priest. They'll just kind of string you along forever. And he didn't like the way that was going. So the Young Rite was created in Young because it was new and fresh and open to new ideas. That's was the intent. And just as an FYI, none of us liked that name, Young Rite. We all hated it, but we were here and we made the best of it. But that was his reason for calling it the Young Rite. And part of what made the Young Rite is that they would pretty much ordain anybody who asked for it. Because the ordination practice of the Young Rite is kind of similar to how the Mormons viewed the priesthood, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in the sense that the way the Mormons do it is every man who's in good standing will likely have some level of the priesthood bestowed upon them. And with the case of the Young Rite, it could be the same way, that every household should have at least one priest, male or female, to provide the sacraments for the household. It's good in theory, but what was happening in reality is people would come to me and be like, "Hey, I want to join the Young Rite." I'm like, "Okay," and I would put them through some sort of process, and they would always have a reason to circumvent the process, get ordained early, with the promise of, "Well, I'll make up the lack of what I know later, but since you're going to be in the area, let's go ahead and do the ordination now." I'm like, "Okay, that sounds good." And then a week later, they're out. They leave, and they go ahead and join somewhere else. The grass is always greener on the other side. So what it was doing is people would joke around that, "Hey, if you want to ordain, go to the Young Rite, get ordained, and then come talk to me. And that was, as a bishop, that was exhausting and that was demoralizing. And I said, you know what? We need to stop doing that. And the Young Rite had a category called a celebrant. A celebrant was basically a priest who could speak for the Young Rite and basically be acknowledged publicly as a priest, as opposed to the non-celebrant, who would be, or anybody could be ordained, but they wouldn't be able to speak on behalf of the community. It was similar to what the Roman Catholic monastic communities in the past used to call simplex priests, or priests that were ordained and only given faculties to say Mass or say Mass privately. Because in the old pre-Vatican II church, you often would have these abbatial monasteries that would have the main conventual Mass, and then each individual priest would say a private Mass. And part of the reason for that is because you could pay the monastery to say Mass on your behalf. And if they had multiple priests, they could collect multiple donations for individual Masses. That makes sense. So the simplex priest wasn't something that was unheard of historically, but it wasn't a good practice, because people would just get ordained and go somewhere else. And it had become kind of a joke within ISM ecclesiastical circles that the Young Rite just ordains anybody. And I still occasionally get messages from people, and they just want a quick ordination, and I'm like, yeah, no, I don't do that anymore. You do the work, we'll ordain you, but if you're going to do the work, you're going to be around a long time, and you're going to have to really pretend to be a part of the community just so you can get ordained and leave. So why would you invest years of your life just to be, ordained so you can leave and do something else? But I want to make sure I emphasize we're not trying to do what the Episcopal Church often does in this country, or as the LCC did, make it difficult for people. We want to make it easy for people, as long as you don't have, as long as you're not on the sexual offender registry, or you got a bad criminal background check. If all your ducks in a row, just do the work. And if you do the work, you're going to get ordained and you're going to be a part of the community. Unless there's a reason why we shouldn't, like severe mental illness, like that. But if you, and we try to make it so the work is not difficult. But when you finish, you'll have the skills, you'll have the knowledge. Because one thing I have noticed in this community, is impostor syndrome. People not feeling like they're competent enough. People not feeling like they know how to perform the basic ministry skills that anybody doing ministry should do. And I've seen that. And I have felt it. So I understand. But now I have the skills because I'm, pretty well educated. And I've been doing this a long enough time to know what I'm doing. But there was a time when I wasn't. And so I understand that imposter syndrome is a real legitimate thing, but we try to make it so that's not an issue with our folks, if that makes sense.
Yes. I think you've touched on two very important aspects, which you also touched on in sacramental whine. So the one is the importance of formation, and the other one is the imposter syndrome.
Yes.
And I don't know if did you grow up Catholic or did you?
No, I did not. I grew up pretty much nothing, and I wanted. I should probably, mention that I don't use the term Catholic, and I've gotten to the point where I really do not like the term. I like the term universal. That's what Catholic means, and I'm perfectly fine with that. Before I started pastoring a church, it was really not a big deal. We just didn't use the word Catholic, and that was it. But now that I'm serving a a church that belongs to, here in the United States, is referred to as United Church of Christ. And it's probably one of the most liberal, progressive denominations that there is. The church that I am serving comes out of the German evangelical tradition, which is basically code word for Lutheran before the term Lutheran was predominantly used. And it uses the Augsburg's Confession, Luther's Catechism, nothing that I overtly disagree with. And it's actually pretty cool reading it in the context in which it was written and how this church evolved over time. I guess to boil it down, I really feel like I'm living in a post-denominational world as a sacramental Christian. And I say sacramental because I subscribe to 7 sacraments. I believe that that matter, form, and intention are essential for the efficacy of the sacraments. So in that sense, I am identical with my Catholic and Orthodox brothers and sisters, but I just don't get caught up in the word Catholic. I don't feel a need to identify that. Now, I can understand somebody who was a cradle Catholic, who was born Catholic, who may still feel the need to use that word Catholic, especially if you had any exposure to traditional Catholicism, because in traditional Catholicism, there still is that idea that outside the church, there's no salvation. There's still the idea that the magisterium of the church is essential for a person's spirituality. And without it, it's like a spiritual void. So I get that. However, even though I spent time in that movement, I don't feel like that is the case. I have experienced the divine in many different ways, some Christian, some not Christian. Do I think that the Roman Catholic Church has a monopoly on truth? Absolutely not. Do I feel that Christianity is the way, the truth, and the life? Yes. I've been walking this Christian path for a while, and I feel that even if science came back and said, we can prove that there was no Jesus, I would go, good for you. Because the message is good. The gospel truly is good news. And, even if, I don't believe that that's not true, but if science did say it was, I would be okay. And because the message is worthy of repeating over and over again. And we get it. That's why we need people preaching it constantly. The real gospel, not some of the crap that you see. So I don't know if that answers your question. I kind of rambled on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think why I touched on that is, in my experience, and, also having experienced this phenomenon of imposter syndrome, I was wondering, if part of it also goes with the identity of, so-called Catholic identity, where for those of us who didn't grow up as cradle Catholics, we get people in the Roman Catholic Church especially saying to us that we are not real Catholics.
Oh,
and
yeah.
then especially for those who didn't grow, who didn't study theology. I happen to have studied theology, but I grew up as Pentecostal. And I, did have some ministry experience, which I felt, helped a lot. But none of that was in the traditional Catholic, background. And so I was wondering, where does this imposter syndrome come from? And I thought maybe that those could be 2 sources, that contribute to that.
Well, I think one of the places that it comes from is a lack of education. I mean, that's if you take a priest who's I'm going to go on record. I hate the term ISM, Independent Sacramental Movement. I hate it. But if I use that term, people instantly know what I'm talking about. So I use it out of necessity, not out of a love for the term. So if I talk to an ISM priest or even bishop, let's say bishop, There are many, many bishops out there that should not be.
Mm-hmm.
I probably shouldn't have been when I was, but I was, and now here I am. But let's just say a bishop. They're a bishop, but yet I tell them, okay, we're going to have an ordination. Bring your vestments. You can vest up. I guarantee you, half of them, or maybe even more than half, will think, oh my gosh, what vestments should I wear? Because I don't know what to wear. I don't know what's proper. Or I might say, hey, wear your choir dress. And they're like, what's that? They don't realize it would be just a cassock and a surplice and maybe a stole, maybe. Or they might put, or we're getting vested and they put the chasuble on and they put the stole on over top of the chasuble, and they think that's fine because they saw somebody do it online, and it's wrong. Or I pull out an amice and they're like, what's that? And it's like, that's where imposter syndrome starts. I mean, it starts in other places too. I remember the first time I did CPE, clinical pastoral education. It was at a hospital in West Virginia. First time I get called to a room. Patient had, I believe, just died, and they wanted me there to pray. I go to the room, and there's like 20 people in a tiny hospital room. And as soon as I walk into the room, the patriarch of the family, he says, everybody, quiet, the pastor's here. Because that's what they call pastors in West Virginia. The pastor's here. And he looked at me and said, and he just kind of nodded like, go ahead and do something. And so I immediately led prayer. I was petrified.
Can you imagine?
First time I had done it in that context. Because keep in mind, prior to that, I served a Unitarian church, which is not really, they don't really believe in anything. They're mostly secular humanists, and prayer was never really a big thing, nor was it wanted or encouraged. Although I occasionally prayed after I would speak. I didn't call it a sermon, but if I did, it was always scripted. So here I am trying to just extemporaneously preach. But you know what? I trusted the Holy Spirit. I trusted my education, and it was fine. And once I did it once, the next time was easier, and then it was easier, and then it was easier. And now, 15 years later, I could do it in my sleep. But that's where imposter syndrome starts. Somebody asks you, I have been with priests in this movement, and I have said to them, hey, why don't, and we were at like a little gathering or something, why don't you say Mass? And they're like, can you do it? And I'm like, yeah, fine, I'll do it. It's like they've never done it publicly. They're like a priest.
Wow.
It's easy to be Father so-and-so when you're doing a Facebook persona, but when you actually have to do it in front of people, I remember the first time I did Sacrament of the Sick. I anointed somebody. I was working hospice. Somebody asked me, they said, we're Catholic, but we don't really want our priest. Can you do it? And I said, yeah, I can do it. And I'm thinking to myself, I've never done it before, but I know the rubrics, and I did it. I went and got some oil, and I did it. And it's ironically, the patient died within seconds after I said the final prayers.
Wow.
So that was affirming, because she didn't die in the time that it took me to go get some oil to anoint her. But imposter syndrome manifests in many different ways. And it usually starts by feeling I'm not good enough. And I'll give you an example. So my academic background, I have an associate's in liberal arts. I have a bachelor's degree in religious studies. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy. I have a master's degree in divinity with a specialization in Black church and African diaspora studies. I have a doctorate of ministry with a specialization in leadership for transformational change. I have 4 units of clinical pastoral education, which is basically the chaplaincy stuff. Just recently, I was asked to be on a committee, which they call a team, in the UCC to determine the future of the association, which is kind of like a middle judiciatory, kind of like a diocese, maybe, although the polity is very different. And so I was asked to be on that because I had just finished my doctorate, and I was telling some folks about how I did my research and whatnot. I basically took 65 of my interviews from Sacramental Whine and repurposed them for my doctoral thesis. And when I was explaining to some folks the process they used, team or committee to help compile data. So anyhow, we're meeting on Zoom, and the association minister, I guess the closest thing would be to a bishop that the UCC has, she's talking and people are talking. And at first, I'm thinking, I'm out of my league. That was my first thought. And like, well, what do you think? And then I started talking. And after I finished saying what I had to say, I thought to myself, that came out of my mouth. I was impressed by what I had to contribute. And I'm like, I do know what I'm talking about. I have done this work before, and I am probably maybe one of two people in this whole group that knows how to do what I just talked about. But it's that sort of latent imposter syndrome that I think many of us in the movement still struggle with. And for me, it's like, okay, now I have 5 degrees, including a doctorate. What's next? Because it's never good enough. I'm constantly chasing my tail. But then part of me is like, I'm 55 years old. I don't have time for anything else. I need to be just content with where I'm at. But still, that inner ache, so to speak, never feels good enough. And I think that is more common in the independent sacramental movement than it is outside of that movement. I encountered priests when I was a traditionalist that were cradle Catholics. And I don't mean cradle Catholics in the common United States sense where, oh, I went to Catholic school, or whatnot. I'm talking, we prayed the rosary every day as a family Catholics. Those kind of cradle Catholics. When it comes time for them to be ordained, it was like they'd been waiting their whole life for it. Do they possibly deal with imposter syndrome? Maybe, but that's so far removed from my world that I can't relate. But I'm sure they have their own issues, and I could probably talk about that at a different time. Imposter syndrome is a big issue, and I think it's part of the reason why people jump from jurisdiction to jurisdiction to jurisdiction, because, well, what they're doing is they're searching for an identity. It would be like, a cradle Catholic looking at a catalog of religious orders and trying to find the one with the right habit that fit their personality. Ooh, I could be a Carmelite. They have nice cream color and black vestments or habits. Or, ooh, the Benedictines, they're all black. White and black. And, it's like searching for what would make you feel whole, what you think would make you feel whole, and bouncing around until you feel like you find it. And I see that all the time. And a lot of times I think it's fueled by imposter syndrome. Oh, if I go to this jurisdiction, they'll have better mentors or whatever, and it's frustrating. And it is, I think, the source of many bishops in the movement, the sleepless nights that come with being a bishop. I mean, you could be a bishop of a large, mainstream church, or you could be a bishop in a small ISM jurisdiction, and oftentimes you're dealing with the same issues, just on a smaller scale, but often unpaid and unsupported. So whereas a bishop of a larger a body who makes a living as a bishop may have to deal with some of the stuff that we deal with. What we're doing is we're dealing with it typically as an all volunteer, and people come, you make connections with them, you consider them part of your community, you ordain them, and then 2 weeks later they're gone. It's not uncommon.
Yeah, I think that is why formation is so important.
Very important. Now we've been having better luck lately as a community because we have been recruiting, I guess, for lack of a better word, outside of the incestuous ISM. So we are finding people who are, United Methodist and other denominations that their systems are bankrupt and not working well at all, but they're finding a home with us because, like, for example, in the Methodist Church, what conference can you go to where you can just call the bishop and have a conversation? But you can with us because I have an open door policy, and I will tell people, hey, you do the work, you'll get ordination. Or if they've already done the work, we'll acknowledge that, and we may require, depending on where they're coming from, something on sacramental theology and our own unique polity. But other than that, we're pretty easy to deal with. And you know what? When you go to get a job as a chaplain and you need an endorsement, getting an endorsement from us or getting an endorsement from one of the big box denominations, it's the same. We are a 501c3 in this country, just like the big box denominations. So on paper, there's no difference between us and the larger denominations. They can still use that ecclesiastical endorsement. And I think people are starting to realize that as the internet, social media, and the world is becoming a smaller place when we're thousands of miles away from each other and we can have a conversation in real time. And it's the same way. The larger denominations no longer have the monopolies that they used to. Yeah, we might not have parishes that you can serve, but you can get endorsed for chaplaincy. And as I'm a witness of, you can serve churches. I am serving a UCC church, and part of the constitution of the church says that they use the Augsburg Confession, Luther's Catechism, the Heidelberg Catechism. I have to confess, I wasn't intimately familiar with any of those documents until I started there, but I started digging into them, and I'm like, this isn't bad. It's not bad at all, because, as an ISM bishop, I don't think any of us subscribe 100% to the Council of Trent, for example. I don't think any of us subscribe 100% to any of the councils after the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and especially those of us who have been exposed to both Western and Eastern forms of the tradition, for example, the Orthodox and Byzantine. We tend to function with sort of a little hybrid of both anyways. Looking up what the early German evangelicals or Lutherans did seems very reasonable, because none of us are selling indulgences or doing what was done in Luther's time, and the church has kind of since Luther kind of evolved into what Luther advocated for anyways. So, I remember once when I was in seminary, I had a guy reach out to me. He wanted ordained, and I said to him, well, explain to me the doctrine of the Trinity. And he goes, oh, I don't believe in the Trinity. I'm like, well, can you explain the doctrine to me? And he's like, not really. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to ordain you. So I guess my point is, I would say if you were to canvass the theology of all the priests and the deacons and the bishops out there in the Independent Sacramental Movement, most of them aren't practicing true Catholic theology anyways. So for me to look at Augsburg and Luther's catechism and the Heidelberg catechism and say, okay, how can I make this come alive for this congregation who, in all honesty, weren't following any of it? But that's what their document said, because their UCC, which is, as I said, is one of the most liberal denominations in the U.S., they have evolved to the point where, the tradition was getting eroded away slowly. And you see it in Catholicism since Vatican II, getting eroded away slowly. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to get back to the roots, and I'm reading the different articles of the Augsburg Confession, and I'm like, okay, it's cool. All right, I can dig it. And I'm having a lot of fun with it. I'm enjoying it, and I am trying to improve the liturgy at this church that was basically non-liturgical until I got there. And I've been taking slow baby steps to get where we want to be, and we're almost where we need to be. We're getting real close. But I do some of the practices that would have been popular 100 years ago in the German evangelical tradition, but also in Roman Catholicism, is I face the East. I don't face the people. I think the reforms of Vatican II, and this is the traditionalist in me speaking, were not good for the church. I like the older ways, and you can still see that type of liturgy in some Lutheran churches that didn't turn the altar around and put a communion table, and you certainly see that in the Orthodox churches. So I think as a world, as a society, as a culture, I think in some ways Christianity is moving into a post-denominational system. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, depending upon how it's how it operates. If it's done in a non-denominational way, then it's just basically church entertainment. But if it's done in a way that still embraces sacramental Christianity, I think it can be done in beautiful ways. So anyhow, I don't know if I've kind of veered off into many different directions.
Just love this conversation with you. I think you're touching on so many important issues. I think coming back to sacraments, within my jurisdiction, we were taught that everything you have to be able to explain it in such a way that an 8-year-old can understand it. So if you had to explain what is a sacrament, in such a way that an 8-year-old could understand it, how would you define or describe the sacrament?
Oh, that's a good question. Sacraments are means in which God freely gives grace to humanity. And the easiest way to describe grace is like food for the soul. And if a child were to say, well, what's a soul? Well, soul is a part of each person. You can't see it, you can't touch it, can't smell it, but it's there. And it includes everything there is about you and who you are. And when your physical body dies, your soul still continues. So it kind of holds your spiritual DNA, if you will. And that would be your soul or spirit. And grace is food for your soul. That's how I would describe it.
That I've never quite heard that definition before. And I think it's very accessible. I think you've touched on the heart, for me, of what Catholicism, if you had to use that term, what it's all about. It's all about the 7 sacraments. And for me personally, what we would describe as the real presence of Christ, within the sacraments. And for me, growing up as a Pentecostal, that is what I always felt was missing, but I couldn't quite put the words to it. A lot of the things that you've described as entertainment, I felt a lot of it, is happening, especially in the Pentecostal and charismatic movement. And I grew up as a classical Pentecostal, so I don't think we quite went that far, in terms of some of the egregious, like concert-like type of entertainment that you would see. But when we did the communion service, it was almost an afterthought.
Yeah, it's like, well, we do this a couple times a year.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we pass along the grape juice and the crackers, and that's it. And when I was first, introduced to the more sacramental churches in my second year of studies, it completely changed my life, and I think it put me on the path that I eventually took to becoming a priest. So I was wondering, a lot of us within the ISM, when we are priests, so we have to be self-supporting. So many of us are bi-vocational as well. So what advice would you give to someone who's in a situation like us, how to balance those two, um, roles, vocations?
Well, I'm going to answer it on a couple of ways. If you find yourself, you've received the priesthood, you know how to say mass, you know how to administer the sacraments, you're pretty good at preaching, but let's say you have no formal education, no seminary or whatnot. Your options may be limited professionally. So in that sense, you may have a church start, you may get a few people. It's not like it's going to ever turn into, in the short term, a means of financial support, and you just acknowledge that. My recommendation there is to always maintain good boundaries, because in that sense, with such a small community and it's all volunteer, it's easy to allow the two worlds to intertwine and intermingle, and it could complicate your life. So try to still always maintain good, solid boundaries, even if you're doing ministry on a volunteer basis and not for your source of income. So there's that. And then as you as you get more education, more opportunities will open. So on the low education end, you may find opportunities to serve as a first responder chaplain with a fire department or a police department. Some of them don't require formal education, just ordination. Those opportunities may open up. And at that point, you're going to need to start being a little bit more savvy, because you're going to be ministering to people who are of different theological and spiritual beliefs as yourself. So make sure you kind of get up to speed on how to minister to people outside of your own tradition without trying to force them into your own tradition. That's a skill, and you need to learn that skill quickly if you're going to do that kind of ministry effectively. Because if you get a reputation of being the chaplain that's preachy, the word will get around and nobody will come to you. And then as you continue to get a little bit more education, a little bit more experience, other opportunities will open. Healthcare chaplaincy in hospitals or hospice. Some correctional facilities require education, some don't. Those are opportunities. So then you can kind of expand your sphere of influence, so to speak, as a clergy person. But then in my case and some other folks, opportunities can open up where mainstream denominations are looking for a pastor. And it may be on your doorstep that it could be you. And, there may be things that you have to do in order to be able to do that. I had to get licensed with the UCC. And I went through that process, got licensed. It helped that I have all the education and I had experience. Had I not had that, it may have been a more difficult process. But, I got licensed, and every year I get renewed, and it's not a big deal. So that's sort of my advice. Another thing, try to be open-minded. Try not to be, my way or our way is the only way. Try to, just be open to new possibilities, and then opportunities will open themselves up. At least that's been my experience.
Well, that's very sound advice. I completely agree. It does sound like the chaplaincy in the UK and the USA presents much more opportunities than what we have in our country, in South Africa, because as far as I know, the only real chaplaincy positions that is paid in our country, there are some chaplains in the police services and then in the military. And there are some schools that, for example, are run by what we would call Anglican, Episcopal in your country.
Yep.
But, mainly most of it would be voluntary positions in both hospice and the chaplaincy. But yeah, it's interesting, as I listen to you, the differences between our country and yours. And I quite agree, that let's say, for example, you really feel called to be a priest, and now by necessity, let's say you have to be a teacher, to rather try and transition into a more clergy type of role where you can earn an income. And then as you upskill yourself, maybe land a position where you can be in the ministry full time.
Yeah, and always be open to the work of the Holy Spirit, because
Yes.
how I got the congregation that I'm serving now, I got them because I was looking for a venue to hold our annual convocation for the Alexandrian community. And so I reached out to a church, got to know the pastor. He was the interim pastor, and he asked me if I ever thought about serving a church. I said, sure, I thought about it. And 4 months later, I was the pastor of the church.
Wow. No, you never know when the Holy Spirit will come knocking, and it will be an opportunity that you never thought about, and that you never actually foresaw on your path.
Mm-hmm.
And just
Yeah,
get to be open.
just be open, because interesting things can happen to those who are open.
When did you first felt the calling to ministry?
A long time ago. I was probably a teenager. Well, no, probably a teenager. I didn't really act upon it until later, but um, I was probably in the military at the time. I was in the Navy. That's what got me into the monastery. And then when I left the monastery and, kind of, kind of left the church altogether, I ended up kind of coming back through the death of my father. It was after my father died. I came back to Christianity after he died. And he was kind of the catalyst for that, because the grief was intense. My life was a mess, and I channeled that grief in positive ways, and here I am. Had I done it negatively, it probably would have gone down a path of addiction and self-destruction, but I didn't. I almost, but then I switched it and went down a positive path. But his death was a big wake-up call for me. And I was 34 at the time.
Sure.
Went back to school, got my college degree, went right to seminary, and there you have it.
I'm jumping around a bit, but that's kind of my connection to you. And I first discovered your ministry and your work was through sacramental wine.
Yeah.
So tell our viewers and listeners, how did that come about? And I know the answer, but I would like them to hear it from you. And the name, the cheeky name of your podcast.
Well, I was actually in the same room. This is our old living room. Our new living room's in the other side of the building, but we were using the old living room here, and I said to my wife, I said, so I want to start a podcast about the Independent Sacramental Movement, and I Latin name like Sacrament. I don't know. I can't even remember. It was some Latin name, and she said, "No, don't do that." I'm like, what do you think would be good? And she goes, why don't you do sacramental wine? Spell it Whine, because you all just a bunch of whiners anyways. And she had a good point. She had a good point. So it was sacramental wine, and I've been doing the play on words ever since. And I kind of started it, in my work in hospice. I was in my car a lot. So I started listening to podcasts, and I thought, man, I could do that. And I taught myself how to do it. I got some equipment and listened to podcasts about podcasting. And I'm not one to you go online and you on podcasting Facebook groups, and people will say, well, how do I do this or how do I do that? I just figured it out. I didn't ask people for stupid questions about how to do things. I just figured it out myself. And started Sacramental Wine, and eventually upped my equipment so I could do interviews, started doing interviews, and developed a workflow. And since then, I've done a few podcasts, and I've edited 2 other podcasts, as like a producer for other podcasts for 2 different people. And, it's been a lot of fun. And, Sacramental Wine, I kind of retired for a couple of years. I brought it back, but I don't have a regular schedule. I just put out an episode whenever I feel like it. And, I was putting it out weekly for a while, but, now I just put it out whenever.
Well, that's a lot of work.
It was a tremendous amount of work. And as you'll soon discover.
I was also, wondering about something that you said earlier, and I think I've been pondering this question ever since I first started listening to your podcast, because, independent Catholic movement, independent sacramental movement, both terms can be very problematic. So how would we refer to our movement? What would be the best way to refer to our movement?
I prefer the term sacramental Christian.
I like that.
Because it's simple, because sacramental Christian includes Catholics. It includes Orthodox. It includes independent Catholics. It includes independent Orthodox. It even includes, I would say, Lutherans, or some Lutherans at least, the Church of Sweden, basically any high church. If you're high church, or even kind of sacramental based low church, some Anglicans would probably fall in that category. If your church is inclined to have weekly communion, and you believe in matter, form, and intention, and some sort of real presence. Because I say that because there is a denomination here in the United States, Disciples of Christ, that have weekly communion that I would not include as sacramental Christians. But if you subscribe to matter, form, and intention, and some sort of real presence, you don't have to call it transubstantiation or go into all that. Because the Orthodox don't necessarily subscribe to transubstantiation, but nobody would not consider them sacramental. So as long as you believe in some sort of real or mystical presence, I think you can be lumped into that sacramental Christian category, which I so much prefer these days than independent Catholic or any use of the word Catholic, because I have been in the traditionalist movement. I have witnessed the battles and fights over the smallest minutia of liturgy, like to the point where the Pope isn't even the Pope. The whole sedevacantist argument,
Yeah.
and it's just, I don't want to be that person.
Mm-mm.
I want to focus my energy on Jesus and the gospel and being a better person, and not investing all of a person's worth on whether or not they accept a certain form of the liturgy, like the Tridentine Mass of Pius V, or something like that. Because there are plenty of valid liturgies out there, that are ancient. The liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, the liturgy of St. Mark, the St. Basil. All these are good, solid liturgies. And throughout Western Europe, similar. You have the Ambrosian Rite, the Mozarabic, you have the Sarum Rite, all these different rites that are just as good as the Tridentine Rite. And even modern liturgies. I mean, I use a liturgy that's certainly not, that's certainly not like as ancient as the Tridentine, but it follows the same liturgical pattern. And, it's, of course, it's in English in the vernacular. And I think it's fine. I think it's fine. I think, we can get caught up in unessentials. And I think part of that getting caught up in unessentials is the word Catholic. I'm fighting that in my own congregation, as some people have mumbled and grumbled, oh, he's trying to turn us Catholic. And how I describe it is, when a family that gets divorced and most of the kids gravitate to one side of the family, as generations go by and they realize, oh, wait a minute, we're related to that other side too. That's, I mean, every European Protestant denomination traces its line through Catholicism. And, when it comes to liturgy and worship, you're going to have some of that spiritual DNA in your system, just like Luther did. Luther changed the liturgy around a little bit, but he didn't change the name. They still called it the Mass. And, and people get caught up on the littlest Mass. It comes from when the priests used to say, ite missa est, go, the Mass is ended. That's where the word Mass comes from. It's not some secret popish plot to control the world. It's just, it was the common people saying, hey, we're going to go to Mass. You're going to go to, because they didn't know Latin. And it's little things. And it's little things about the faith that you pick up when you pastor a church that you don't get when you don't do a whole lot of face-to-face ministry with people, which is not uncommon in the ISM. What most of us in the ISM are worried about, stuff like apostolic succession and all that, most people don't care about at all.
Sad
people
but true.
People in the pews, they don't care about apostolic succession.
No.
You're up there and you're dressed in a robe or vestments or whatever. People are going to acknowledge you as, well, you're the minister, you're the priest, you're the bishop. They're not going to question that. You might question it, but they're not. They're not concerned about the things that the clergy and ISM are typically concerned about. They're just not. What they are concerned about is a lot of other things. So you have to be able to be quick on your feet.
What I'm really hearing is for me, it's about getting back to basics. We always say on our website, as the White Robed Monks of St. Benedict, that Jesus only gave us 2 commandments, to love God and to love our neighbors ourselves. And I kind of feel like anything else is almost superfluous. We make such a big thing, like you said, about the non-essentials. Yes, of course, for me, matter, form, and intent and all of that is important, but Yeah, like getting caught up about what liturgy is the one true liturgy, and stuff like that. And the average person in the pew, might be battling, how to get through the month financially, and they want a message. They want the Holy Eucharist, and so I think you've touched on some very important, important truths that I think gets on the wayside, especially in our movement.
Yeah. Yeah, which is I think one good litmus test for any would-be priest is if I'm if I am your bishop and I ask you to preach and I tell you you got 5 minutes, you should be able to do it.
Yep.
And if you tell me, well, can I have a week to prepare? I'm going to say you don't need to, you shouldn't be a priest.
Yeah, yeah. And I would totally agree with you. Yes.
I remember my first preaching class. The professor walks into the class with a basket, has each one of us pick a paper out of the basket, but don't look at it yet. And then he said, after everyone got their paper, he said, okay, look at your passage. I flipped it over, and mine was the first line of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And he told us, okay, you got 5 minutes to prepare to preach a 1-minute sermon on that passage.
Wow.
That's probably one of the hardest things I ever did in seminary. But it prepared me. And so, for example, now I do a service every month at a local assisted living facility. I do a communion and I preach, but I don't use a script and I don't even look up the scripture. Right before the service starts, I pull up my phone, look up the Revised Common Lectionary, see what the gospel is for the closest Sunday, and that's what I'm going to preach on. And so then I look it up and I bookmark it, and then when it's time, I read it and I immediately start preaching whatever comes to me. And that's probably some of my best sermons. So I think that is a good litmus test for formation. If if I ask you, hey, I need you to preach, you can be petrified and you can be like screaming on the inside. But if you do it, then you've done well. But if you let that fear consume you, then you probably shouldn't be ministering to people often in their most vulnerable times. Because how are you, if you can't get up and just proclaim the gospel that you say you believe in, then how can you be with somebody when they're dying?
Yes.
How can you be with somebody when they lost their child? How can you be with somebody in the worst times of their life or the joyous times of their life? If you just can't get up and tell me what you believe or you say you believe. Anyhow, I'm kind of going back to the imposter syndrome, but that's the quickest way to extinguish it is me putting you on the spot and you getting up and you doing what you say you can do. And then, okay, we're good. You deserve to be a priest.
What you've mentioned now is so true. If I think back to my own formation, all of the assignments that we had to do had to be in such a way that an 8-year-old could understand it. And that's much more difficult than it sounds like. And we also had to bring everything back to the Sermon on the Mount and to 1 Corinthians 13. And, although I had like the seminary experience, and the privilege of studying theology, I think that also really trained my mind in such a way to be an academic, where I really had to knock down that kind of thinking to a more pastoral thinking. So that was, quite a challenge for me. And I also remember the first time I rocked up at the hospice and said that, I want to volunteer, and they just threw me in a deep end and said, well, there you go, And the first person that I dealt with died within 2 days. And to deal with that, and the imposter syndrome kept on coming up. Oh gosh, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. But I think if I had to describe it, I would say it's being a compassionate presence. Sometimes
Yes, the
yeah,
best advice that I can give for anybody wanting to do hospice work, especially if they feel like they're not prepared for that, is just to be present and shut up.
yeah, yeah,
Don't talk.
yeah,
Don't talk. Don't say anything. If somebody starts talking to you, focus on listening.
yes,
Um, because sometimes just being there can make a difference. And you don't have to, usually when people talk a lot in those situations, it's their nerves, they're nervous, they're
yes,
anxious. So they
yes,
talk out of their anxiety. Force yourself to become one with the awkward silence.
yeah,
And then you learn to love that awkward silence, and it will be your best friend. And I'll end on one kind of story. I was on call with hospice, and I had to go to this room at a facility. So I walk in. There was some interesting dynamics in the family. You could tell right away. And I introduced myself, and then I immediately shut up. And then one of the family members looked at me, and she's like, "Well, you're the chaplain, right?" And I'm thinking, "Yeah, I just told you that." And I said yes. And then they go, "Well, why don't you say something like you're going to say something to make it all better?" Which there's nothing I could do to make it all better. So I said, "Well, that's your dad, right?" And they go, "Yeah." I'm like, "Well, what was he like?" And then I shut up. And they started telling stories about him. And there were times when we would all laugh because it was kind of funny. And then somebody would tell another story that was kind of sad. And then, and then I would occasionally interject with, "Your dad seemed like a really cool guy," and then that would get them talking about something else. An hour goes by. And then I think they'd probably talked enough. And there was a little pause. And I said, "Do you mind if I say a prayer?" And they're like, "Well, yeah, go ahead. That's why you're here." And so now I felt like I knew him. I had never met him before. I never met any of them before. Now I felt like I knew him. And so I say a prayer that was meaningful for everybody. And I wish them well. I said, "Well, I'm going to go ahead and go." And they said, "Thanks for coming." Well, that wasn't my regular patient. That wasn't part of my regular caseload. But I was on call. It was the night shift chaplain. Patient had died shortly thereafter, probably the next day or whatever. The family asked me to do the funeral because they said I was amazing. And I didn't do anything other than shut up. And so in almost every ministry situation, if you practice that, I don't care if it's a conflict in the church, or if it's a pastoral visit to somebody who's dying or whatnot, listening. And when you do speak, it's very intentional, and it's designed not to show how smart you are, but it's designed to get them to open up. And there are obviously opportunities for you to teach and to educate, but most of the time, that's not what people are looking for. They're looking for you to listen. And we often forget that.
We are often reminded about that within our order, because the first words of the rule of Saint Benedict is "Asculta," listen. I think I would like to ask you one last question, if you don't mind, and
Sure.
that is one I often ponder as well. We seem to be living in what a lot of people would call a post-Christian world. And how do you think we can reach out to people who would describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, or not religious, and people who've been hurt in the church, and how do we reach out to them?
Well, that's a good question. I'm trying to figure that one out myself, as I need to grow a small church. A small church in a big building. But I think one way is to be authentic. Don't try to be anything that you're not. And I learned that from my studies in Black church studies, because the Black church is all about being authentic. They will sniff you out if you're acting some way that's not you. putting on a front or a show. So be authentic, but don't focus on the things that may necessarily be um, your things. Try to meet people where they're at. I am not the kind of person that is all sin and forgiveness or sin and redemption. It's just not part of my spirituality, but it is for others. So in our social media posts, I make sure I include some of that every now and then, because some people it may resonate with. So recognizing that people look at spirituality differently, and you may have to speak a little bit differently to get through to people. I can talk over and over again about unity and love, and for some people, it may not get through to them. So I may have to talk a little bit about justice and God's justice. They may be social justice oriented. I may need to talk about, sin and forgiveness. I may sometimes need to talk about, endurance and overcoming pain and suffering as Jesus did. So I may have to speak in these different sort of theological language to get through to people and not just focus on one way. Because even if you aren't religious, but you get your spirituality through pop culture, you're still getting it somewhere. So I think deep down, everybody speaks some form of spiritual language that speaks to them. And you just need to be able to know which one it is. So if you're only speaking to one small demographic, you're going to miss everybody else. And then the last advice in ministering to the unchurched is have faith. We live in a world where, we'll look to the business community and see what they say about marketing and growth. What we need to do is look at what the Desert Fathers and Mothers said and have faith that what we're doing is what God has ordained and God has blessed. Because, some MBA may say, oh, you're doing it all wrong. But if the gospel and the Desert Fathers said, do it this way, I'm going to do it the way they said it.
I like that. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I cannot believe, basically an hour or so has already passed, and it feels like I've just spoken to you for 5 minutes, and so thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. And,
well, I'm going to have you on Sacramental Whine.
I would love that. Thank you. That would be my ultimate. So, yeah, definitely would like to chat to you again if you're up to it. And I think there was so much. I had like this whole list of questions and stuff. And I've learned over the years to, just go with the flow, just to.
Well, you can always have. You can always have me on again.
I would love that. Thank you.
Get some more people and then bring me back. I've always got something to say. I've always got.
Yeah. No, I definitely want to tap into your wisdom and your experience. And, just as an aside, it was like really debating about the name of my channel. And I've got friends across the spectrum, from liberal Catholic to the Roman Catholic woman priest, Anglican, Methodist, all over. And it's also debating this or asking some advice from our abbot and bishop in America. And he basically said, well, why don't you have two channels? The one in which I can do more of my interfaith stuff, and then, the one that's more Catholic. And I was, even debating with a friend about whether to use the term Catholic or not. And I think I very deliberately settled on Catholic because I wanted to enter into that space where, the Catholic space is so dominated by people who are so fundamentalist, like Taylor Marshall and people like him. And then the word Maverick came to me. And I think I heard it the first time, it was used in relation to Senator McCain.
Oh, yeah.
I had no idea what it meant at the time. And I don't know, the term just came back to me. And, it's talking about somebody who thinks and acts independently. And I would say that's somebody who breaks the mold. And, when I had we spoke earlier about the sign at my back, I ordered that from Timo, and they're not sponsoring this talk. And, some of the sites didn't want to accept the term because it also means unorthodox, So
Yeah.
I suppose it saw it as very offensive. And I just had to chuckle about that, because I definitely think that you and we are mavericks. And we don't really believe in the mold. And I think that's how the channel name came together for me. I just really want to create a space where we can bridge the gap, between those who see themselves as more traditional and those of us who see ourselves as progressive, and also within the sacramental Christian movement,
Yeah.
because I even Googled and I couldn't really find many, of us in that space on YouTube. So I thought, I think there's a gap there, and I'll see where it takes me.
Well, good luck with your channel, and I wish you a long success.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your time.